All right, welcome everybody. My name is Matt Dallin. I'm with the Virginia Department of Conservation and Recreation. This is the 2024 Virginia Flood Preparedness Coordination Meeting, which is also our kickoff meeting for the Virginia Flood Protection Master Plan. Thank you for joining us today. On today's agenda, it's split into two parts. So we're going to have some presentations in the first half of the meeting. These presentations are going to be live streamed, as is the video and audio from the room. Once we get into the agency presentations, we'll be able to do some question and answer after that. We're going to take a break around 3:10 or so. And then after that break, we're going to stop the live stream and just focus on an in-person workshop here for our in-person attendees. And that'll go till about 4 o'clock till we wrap it up with some closing remarks and then adjourn for the day. If you need the restrooms inside, there's a couple off to the right on the back hall. There's more outside to the right past the elevators. There's also water fountains outside. We have coffee and snacks in here as well. So thank you for your time today. Really appreciate you all being here and helping us, the state, deal with flood resilience. With that, I'd like to kick it over to Director of Department of Conservation and Recreation, Matt Wells.
All right, thanks, Matt. Good afternoon, everyone. How we doing? Everybody awake? Good? Got coffee over there if you're not. So I want to welcome everyone to the 2024 Annual Flood Preparedness Coordination Meeting. This is the second year that we've done it. Very happy to welcome you all. Appreciate you giving your time up this afternoon to talk about this important topic. I know that there are a lot of things that you could be doing today, but pleased that we've got so many representatives from state agencies and office and local and regional government, nonprofits, and really others that are just interested in this topic. So I'm going to frame a little bit about the challenge, although I know most of you are very familiar with this, and some of these slides will be repeats for those of you that have seen me do presentations before. Talk a little bit about the progress that we've made today to sort of frame what we want to get out of this meeting. So I guess to shock anyone that flooding is a significant challenge around the Commonwealth, and while we often think of it as primarily a coastal risk, a significant portion of the historic flooding across the Commonwealth has been focused in the Valley and South Side, more recently in Southwest Virginia. If you look at the financial impact between 1950 and 2021, it's about $900 million in flood-related damages, and you've seen that accelerate really over the past 20 to 30 years in picking up. Where am I going? Somebody get to the next one for me. Picture, okay. So just because flooding is a statewide challenge doesn't mean that it's always experienced the same way, right? Coastal Virginia experiences flooding very differently from tidal flooding. Southwest Virginia, the Valley experienced it differently in flash flooding coming down the mountain, south side from significant riverine flooding. So it's a statewide issue, but there's no one simple statewide solution or way to address it. I broke the clicker, sorry. So this is a map of coastal Virginia, and this is pulled from the Coastal Resilience Master Plan Phase 1. On the right side, you can see a map of present conditions in terms of flood inundation areas, and on the left, you see the projected conditions in 2080. And what you can probably pick up here is that there are significant projected impacts to coastal Virginia, and this manifests itself in impacts to people, to buildings, and to our natural resources, and ultimately to our economy as well. A significant portion of the Commonwealth's economy is based in what we term as coastal Virginia, which really goes all the way up 95 corridor into northern Virginia. So we've got a problem. We've got a charge to address flooding as a Commonwealth and as DCR to try to minimize the loss of life, property damage, and negative impacts that are a result of flooding. And the way that we have framed our means of addressing this is with 4 guiding principles that we really landed on at the beginning of the administration. I want to acknowledge Secretary of Natural and Historic Resources and Chief Resilience Officer Travis Voiles, who's here, who was a big part in sort of developing these guiding principles and helping us stick to them. So first of all, we are committed to addressing challenges related to flooding and resilience. This is something that we were pretty clear on when the administration first came in, that even though this is a continuation of an effort from previous administrations, it's something that we are committed to addressing as well. Second, that we have to address these challenges with programs that work for all impacted parts of Virginia. Again, this isn't a coastal problem, it's a statewide problem. Just because they're different, just because flooding looks differently doesn't mean that we ignore it somewhere. Right? Third, that we have to address these challenges with comprehensive, cohesive plans and programs that work together. And so a lot of what we're going to be talking about today are plans, right? How do we develop these plans? How do we make them work together? How do we draw all the data sources, all the resources that we have available together into something that's cohesive, that works for our citizens in our localities? And then finally, that we have to do all of this with transparency and input from the public. At the end of the day, it's the people of Virginia who are impacted. And so it's incumbent on us to make sure that as we try to plot a more flood resilient future, that we're doing so in a manner that reflects what they need and that they can understand. So how have we done? I don't know if you can read these slides or not. The new big TVs are great. So we have made a tremendous amount of progress since 2020. And this, I think this is the first time I had ever really seen it all together, was when we put this slide together. And it's a little overwhelming, and you can really see, and this wasn't intentional, but it's kind of grown year over year, right? So from 2020, with the development of the Coastal Resilience Master Planning Framework and the launch of the Community Flood Preparedness Fund, all the way through 2022, where the Coastal Resilience Master Plan was codified, where we established a Coastal Resilience Technical Advisory Committee in statute, where we established the Resilient Virginia Revolving Fund, where we continued the work of the Community Flood Preparedness Fund. Last year, we in DCR formally established our Office of Resilience Planning as a standalone office. We released our first Status of Flood Resilience report. We convened the Resilience Coordination Working Group, and I know many of you were on that group that met monthly over the course of 2023. And thank you for giving your time to help plan how we can do a better job of coordinating our resilience efforts, continuing the work with the Flood Fund and launching the Revolving Fund. And then last year in 2024, I think this year, has really been a pivotal year and will continue to be a pivotal year for our efforts at resilience in the Commonwealth. First, we're going to release phase 2 of the Coastal Resilience Master Plan, which we'll talk about in a second. Part of that has been underlined with a community outreach and engagement plan the department has released that we are pursuing, again, to make sure that we do this planning for the proper public engagement. We established a Flood Resilience Advisory Committee to help guide the development of the statewide Virginia Flood Protection Master Plan. We established an interagency resilience management team through statute to make sure that all the various agencies are talking to each other about what they're doing in resilience. And to help guide that and support that, we worked on legislation that significantly strengthened our Chief Resilience Officer position and established an Office of Commonwealth Resilience. And so for the first time in the Commonwealth, we will have a funded standalone CRO position. We will have some staff to support that effort, which we have rescoped as a broad all hazards position to really help tie our resilience efforts together and to help seek out funding and to provide more support for localities. And then finally, we've continued our work with the Community Flood Preparedness Fund. We have round 5 out now. It closes in November. We are, as with last year, offering $85 million in grants and loans. We've made a couple of modifications this year that we hope are kind of quality of life improvements for applicants. One, we are collecting information on loans for financial information after the award is made. So if you want a loan from the CFPF, really all you got to do is check a box. And we'll come back to you later once the award is made to find out the financial information. We're also allowing revolving fund loans to be used as match for the first time. And again, the financial information we'll collect on the back end. If you're a community and you want to use a loan as match from the revolving fund, really all you got to do is check that box and we'll work with you on that. Not on this slide, frankly, because there's not enough room, is all of the tremendous community work that we have been doing, both through the Office of Resilience Planning. I know they had a community meeting last night in Chesapeake. They've been having those around the Commonwealth, but also with our Office of Floodplain Management. I see Angela Davis over there. Over the past couple of years, we have reviewed and approved flood resilience plans that have enabled more than 60 counties, cities, and towns to, one, become more resilient, but also to access project funding from the Community Flood Preparedness Fund. We provided 30 floodplain management trainings that have benefited more than 120 localities across Virginia. So for DCR's part, we are out there in the community. We are out there working with localities to help them chart a course to be more resilient. I mentioned some of the Flood Resilience Advisory Committee. So this is a new group that was established in statute this past year. We currently have a Coastal Resilience Technical Advisory Committee to guide a coastal plan, and we felt like we needed a statewide group to help work on the statewide plan. So this group will convene formally in February of 2025, although we're doing a little bit of teeing up today, a little bit of a preview when we talk about the Flood Resilience Master Plan. The structure of this group is primarily state agencies, commissions, and authorities, but we also crafted this to require this body to consult with a whole wide array of stakeholders outside of the advisory committee. So we will still be pulling in many, many voices to help guide the development of this plan. The Interagency Resilience Team is an inward-facing group that is designed to ensure that state agencies are all talking to each other. There is a list of designated agencies that are required to designate a resilience coordinator. Those coordinators will meet, led by the Chief Resilience Officer, to talk about resilience best practices, to share information, and generally to make sure that the lines of communication stay open. I mentioned the Coastal Resilience Master Plan. We've got a number of existing planning documents that have been adopted. So CRMP Phase 1, which was a partial risk assessment for coastal Virginia. You saw the map. Phase 1 really took into account tidal flooding, right? So sea level rise and subsidence. It had a static web explorer for project and it had a lot of good information. It was a good start. Right? I think it was a good place to begin from. We're going to be adding on to that with Coastal Resilience Master Plan Phase 2. Obviously, also a lot of work going on with VDEM, who really has traditionally led the charge on our emergency preparedness and continue to do so with their hazard mitigation plan. And our friends at VDOT have been hard at work, I know, on their own resilience plan. Obviously, our roads are significant assets for the Commonwealth. They're things that we need to get around and to do business and to live our lives, and we want to make sure that that infrastructure is prepared for flooding as well. So I mentioned the Coastal Resilience Master Plan and the Virginia Flood Protection Master Plan. So CRMP Phase 2 builds upon the foundation of Phase 1. We are adding additional risk types. So we'll be adding pluvial flooding data, riverine flooding data. We will have a dynamic inventory of projects that I think is actually is live now. It's live now. We will be enhancing the Coastal Resilience Web Explorer, which if you haven't been to is really cool. We will be updating our inventory of assets and risk so that we can get a more holistic picture of the risk around the Commonwealth and to help provide information that localities can use about how to address this risk. The Virginia Flood Protection Master Plan is primarily focused at the state level to help guide state agencies as they make policies that impact resilience around the Commonwealth. We will have some significant flood data that we add to that as well. It won't be as granular as the regional plan, but certainly an important step towards addressing the statewide problem. This is a document that is required to be updated every 5 years. The last time it was updated was 2005. All right, so we were a little bit late on that one, but we're going to be early when we deliver the update in December of 2025. So what do I mean when I say we're adding on data with the Coastal Resilience Master Plan Phase 2? I just want to give a little bit of an example here. So this is the FEMA flood depth map for the city of Richmond. You can see the James River, Shaka Valley, a couple of tributaries there. So this is the data that we have now. This is the data when you add in rainfall. Now, I'll caveat this by saying that this doesn't take stormwater infrastructure into account completely. So you're not going to see ponding to this level, but I think it gives you an idea, one, of where your hotspots are going to be in a storm that overwhelms stormwater infrastructure, but two, just how incomplete a picture of flooding that we have now. And so adding on this data, we hope will be of significant value for localities, for state agencies, and for individuals as they try to address flood resilience. So for today's meeting, we hope you take away a couple things. One, new ideas and opportunities for enhancing coordination between flood resilience and preparedness activities across your various agencies and localities. 2, a clearer understanding of the purpose and process for the Virginia Flood Protection Master Plan. Like I said, the new TAC doesn't start until February of next year, but we wanted to get a head start on that. This is a significant effort for us. And then 3rd, we want to reestablish, strengthen, or establish lines of communication between DCR and consultants. So as we develop the Flood Protection Master Plan, we're doing so with input from all the people in this room and from all the impacted stakeholders. And so with that, very much appreciate again everyone's time this afternoon. Look forward to a productive conversation. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you very much, Director Wells. We're going to switch over to our next presentation. Also switch over our slide advancer. Hopefully that one works this time. So up next, we have a presentation from Rachel Slaughter, who is the Strategic Planning Branch Manager at the Virginia Department of Environmental Management. So here we go, Rachel. I think it's working. Yeah. Always.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having us here today. My name is Dr. Rachel Slaughter, and the Strategic Planning Branch Manager, as Matt said, at the Virginia Department of Emergency Management. So I'm here today and honored to have the opportunity to speak on the 2023 Commonwealth of Virginia Hazard Mitigation Plan. Let's see if this works. All right, okay. So the Hazard Mitigation Plan for the Commonwealth provides guidance for all of the activities we have going on across the Commonwealth pertaining to hazard mitigation. The vision for this plan is supported by different goals, objectives, and prioritized actions that ultimately are aiming to reduce damages and injuries from natural hazards to residents, communities, state facilities, and critical facilities across the Commonwealth. This plan is supported by 4 authorities at the federal and state level. At the federal level, we have the Disaster Mitigation Act of 2000. This enables the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, to be able to give out hazard mitigation grant funding to any state or locality that has an approved mitigation plan. And that component is really important for a later part of our presentation. We also have 3 state level authorities that support this plan. The first, 44-146.17, allows the governor to appoint a coordinator to oversee emergency management response, preparedness, and recovery. The next, 44-16.18, enables that coordinator to make a staff, make a team, all of us here at VDEM, to be able to put into place plans, policies, and procedures to carry out those emergency management actions from day to day. And the final one, 44-146.22, enables the governor to consider different hazard mitigation recommendations that we make to him that would help reduce loss and damage across the Commonwealth. I'm going to talk through today some of the different planning elements in the 2023 version of this plan. So I'll provide us with an overview of the planning process, the risk assessment process we used, the mitigation strategy, which is really the bulk of the plan and the true value as we move into the implementation phase now, along with the maintenance, adoption, and assurances that are a part of this plan. As I noted, the plan was dated in 2023. That means it was approved by FEMA and formally adopted by the Governor of Virginia in 2023. FEMA requires that you make a hazard mitigation plan and update it at least every 5 years. So here in Virginia, we'll continue to follow this plan through 2028. But let me bring us back to the beginning and share with you how we came to develop this plan and update the 2018 version of the plan. A member of my team at the Strategic Planning Branch at VDEM, the Hazard Mitigation Planner, alongside our wonderful contracting partners at Old Dominion University, got together and reviewed the current plan and wanted to identify how can we improve this going forward. And a really key component of that was how can we coordinate with more folks from across the state to make sure we're truly capturing a holistic perspective of mitigation. This group got together and identified a planning process. It had 4 phases. The first was getting organized. No surprise there. If there's any planners in the room, you know how important that is. But for them, they really wanted to make sure, as compared to that 2018 plan, that they were bringing all of the right people to the table. So they created a plan for identifying who those individuals were and how they go about coordinating with them during this planning process. Next, they moved to phase 2, assessing risk, where they identify the different hazards that impact the Commonwealth and then move to assess the risks affiliated with each of those hazards. The third phase was developing the mitigation plan. They looked at that mitigation strategy and identified a number of different mitigation actions to support different components of that. They spent a very, very long time writing up the plan. I think it's 885 pages in total. And then, as many of you know, they worked through the challenging process of revision. So they were able to successfully get that approved by FEMA and then move into phase 4, which was adoption and implementation. And I'll note here, we're still in that step 10. We will be implementing that plan across a 5-year process since it is a 5-year cycle for us. I'd like to touch on some of these phases at more length, just some of the high levels. I won't talk us through an 885-page plan, don't worry. But the first step in phase 1, when the team came together, that red circle you can see on the screen, the analysis team, which was the VDEM group, along with those Old Dominion University contractor teams, they had received feedback from FEMA in 2018 that they left some important players out of the conversation. They involved a lot of emergency managers. They did a good job at that, but they had forgotten to include some key sectors, including economic development, land use and development, housing, health and social services, infrastructure, and natural and cultural resources. So when it came time for them to try to identify their advisory committee members, they looked to make sure these sectors, along with a number of others, were best incorporated in that committee. And then that final working group just included everyone that the team had conversations and feedback in as a component of the plan. Diving more into phase 2 in the risk assessment process, our team completed a hazard identification and risk assessment, or as we call a HIRA. This methodology looked at 17 different hazard types across the jurisdictions, and they wanted to be able to rank and prioritize them. To be able to do that, they considered a number of different parameters, the history of occurrence, so how often were these things happening across the Commonwealth, where were they happening in the Commonwealth, vulnerability of people in the hazard area. This was something in comparison to 2018, the team really wanted to emphasize and get right. They wanted to make sure they were considering where different vulnerable populations could be impacted by these hazards and accurately capturing that in our plan. Probable geographic extent of the hazard area. So what's the scope of impact for the hazard and the risks affiliated with that? And then they also tried to gather any historical crop and property damage data that they were able to collect for each hazard. Ultimately, they were able to rank and prioritize the 17 hazards from high to negligible. And I'll note here the 3 high priority hazards were identified to be flood, hurricane, and winter weather. To build out that HIRA, they did some different things as well. One of the things they did was to try to incorporate more tools from FEMA. And I'll highlight here the community lifelines. This has really become important in the emergency management realm over the last few years. So by incorporating these 7 community lifelines you see across the top of the screen, they're able to give more context to how a community, how those vulnerable populations would be impacted during the emergency response part of a disaster. So they were able to provide that oversight into each of the different hazards they considered. As they wrapped up the HIRA, they also recognized in having these important conversations with stakeholders that there were a lot of capabilities that the Commonwealth already had in place. So a huge component of the 2023 planning process and in the planning document is to capture that capability assessment. So they provide an overview of our capabilities at the local, regional, state, and federal level. And this basically captures what's the Commonwealth already doing well at hazard mitigation and what efforts are we continuing to plan to do as we look forward into this 5-year cycle. Also in the planning development phase, they moved to write a mitigation strategy. And the vision for this is to promote resiliency and reduce long-term impacts of hazards on human, economic, and natural resources across the state. To achieve this strategy, they identified 74 total mitigation actions. 28 of those actions were new for the 2023 plan. 41 were carryovers from the last plan, but may have had additional items added, additional things that localities were working on. 3 were in progress and 2 were ongoing from the 2018 plan. Here's an example of the type of information that was included in the plan for each of these 74 mitigation actions. Notably, they provide cost benefit of the work being done for each mitigation action. They identify the hazards that are addressed. This font is smaller than some of my other slides. Hold on. They identify the key thing I wanted to highlight here. They identify what different jurisdictions across the Commonwealth and what different tribal nations across the Commonwealth are doing, and the amount of grant dollars, and along with other budget dollars that are being spent to address this mitigation action and support the ultimate mitigation strategy. So this is provided again for each of the 74 mitigation actions in the plan. Another key component of the plan was to identify what our localities, jurisdictions, and tribal nations are doing in terms of their own hazard mitigation planning. You'll remember at the beginning, I noted that with the Disaster Mitigation Act of 2000, it's not just enough for the state to have a hazard mitigation plan approved by FEMA. Localities must have one as well to be eligible for that FEMA hazard mitigation grant funding. So this part of the plan identifies the support VDEM provides to the different jurisdictions across the Commonwealth. And for us, that largely looks like both support from VDEM headquarters, where my team sits and where the grant team sits, but also support at the different VDEM regions. There's 7 in total, and each has all hazard planners and recovery and mitigation specialists. So those individuals work very closely with the jurisdictions and localities as they develop their plans and carry out the different mitigation action work that they're doing. Notably, I said we had 7 VDEM regions, but there are 21 PDCs across the Commonwealth. So those 7 regions split up to support the PDCs. In some cases, there are multiple regions that do provide support, but these are the different hazard mitigation plans that our office, in partnership with the regions, tries to provide support with across their own 5-year cycle to make sure everyone is eligible to receive that very valuable hazard mitigation funding. After the team had written up this plan, it had been approved by FEMA. They looked to move towards the implementation, maintenance, and adoption phase. I think the most important thing here is that this plan is a living document. You'll hear emergency management planners say all the time, it's not the plan document that really matters. What matters is the networks and connection that you make across that planning process, and we are seeing that come true across these 5-year cycles. I will also note in this case, you have to have the plan document to get the money. So this plan document is also very important, but those networks and connections extend beyond just that plan and help individuals in different jurisdictions plan to best prevent loss and damage across the different communities in the Commonwealth. Just to highlight a couple of key changes for us from 2018 to 2023, there was a lot of difference in what our HIRA captured. We recategorized a number of hazards. We provided a lot of additional information on what these hazards were, what the background information was historically here in the Commonwealth, and they pulled in some FEMA data and FEMA systems to be able to better frame that information. We also revised our mitigation goals and objectives. And our real key thing here I want to highlight is, again, people. We really increased participation in our advisory committee and our working group. You'll see for both, they either doubled or almost doubled. And those are partnerships we're continuing to try to strengthen as we work towards our 2028 plan cycle. I'll just close here and share VDEM headquarters is currently working towards achieving enhanced plan status, which would enable us to be eligible to receive more grant funding. So that's our current goal at headquarters. And we're also working to work through some of these opportunities for improvement you see on the slide. So we want to do a better job at engaging environmental and historic resources at the local level. We want to do a better job, especially at sharing to other jurisdictions, trying to get more involved in mitigation, what community rating system communities in the Commonwealth are already doing well, what are those best practices in making those connections. And then we, again, want to continue to build on that information we learned about vulnerable populations and making sure we're accurately capturing their needs and requirements into the plan document as we look forward to 2028. So thank you all. It's been great to speak with you today. Just kidding. I'll take questions.
Any questions for Rachel? All right. Thank you very much, Rachel. All right, we're going to move on to the next presentation, get that switched out. While we're doing that, I'd like to introduce Chris Berg from the Virginia Department of Transportation, who is the Director of Sustainability.
Good afternoon, everybody. As Matt said, I'm Chris Berg, the Director of VDOT's Sustainability Office, which houses our resilience program for the department. So here this afternoon, just to give an update on the implementation of VDOT's resilience plan and our overall resilience efforts. So as Director Wells showed earlier, around the 2020-2021 timeframe, really significant statewide resilience efforts were underway. So in response to that, the department set about to kind of institutionalize resilience within our work. And that started with just coming up with a definition of what resilience means in the transportation context. So you can see at the top there is kind of the definition that we landed on. Essentially, the ability of a transportation project or an asset to anticipate, prepare for, and recover from a hazard. So once we defined that, the next step, as you can see on the bottom there, was really to figure out how we incorporate this concept of resilience across all of our existing business practices, from planning to project development, delivery, operations and maintenance, emergency management. So how can we apply this resilience lens to everything that we do? And that resulted in the resilience plan, which you can see on the right there, which we released in November of 2022, which really set out the framework for the next 2 to 3 years for the department to, as I said, really just instill resilience into all of our work. That resilience plan is really organized around 6 key objectives or strategies, which you can see here. So these are, relying on making data-driven decisions, engaging with stakeholders, identifying which assets where our infrastructure is vulnerable, applying different resilience measures to address those vulnerabilities, but also looking at which of those practices are actually feasible and cost effective. And then, of course, funding, looking at our existing and potential additional funding opportunities to support all of this work. And though these are numbered, these are all kind of worked on simultaneously at the department at varying levels. So this afternoon, I'll just go through a quick update on each one of these objectives and where we stand today. So I mentioned data. Obviously, as we all know, data, having the most up-to-date data and information is really critical when you're working to address flooding. So we set out with kind of a data and research plan that looked across all of our data, our partners' data, federal data, to really see what we have currently, what's coming in the future, what we need to develop in-house, really where our gaps are. And then to address those gaps in terms of where we are today, we've got around 16 research projects underway through our Virginia Transportation Research Council, looking at everything from hydraulics, materials, geotechnical impacts of flooding, historical flooding throughout the state, traffic operations, really every aspect, trying to make sure we have the data and the tools and the resources that we need to do this work. So those are all ongoing, hoping to be complete in the next year or two. And we're also finalizing an updated data and research plan that will really guide our work over the next few years. The second strategy is really focused on engagement and outreach, which, as we all know, as DCR has mentioned, is a critical piece of all of this work, making sure what we're doing is communicated out to the public, but is also informed by input from the public and stakeholders like all of us here today. So we did release earlier this year a coordination and outreach plan for our resilience work that just kind of lays out who we see as the key stakeholders and how we are engaging and will continue to engage with them. And you can see here just a list of kind of the continued coordination and outreach that we have underway, including Coastal Resilience Master Plan and other local and regional efforts and federal efforts that we're involved in around resilience. So the third strategy is really kind of the mapping visualization piece. So figuring out across the transportation system where we're most vulnerable to primarily flooding. So we, over the last year, building on the work from our sister agency, the Office of Intermodal Planning and Investment, some work they've done over the past few years, as well as work that's happening at the federal level. We're updating kind of a methodology that'll allow us to look across all of our assets and again, see where we're exposed to hazards, where we're sensitive to hazards, and kind of where our most critical nodes are that we should focus on our mitigation efforts. So status update for where we are today, we're hoping to finalize this initial version of our, what we're calling our at-risk infrastructure visualization tool by the end of this year. And then next year, we'll be working to roll that out to the public and really apply that across our work. So I won't get too in depth here, but just a quick look at the methodology for this visualization tool to really see where our infrastructure is vulnerable. Starts with exposure. So what assets are exposed to hazards, whether it's flooding, sea level rise, coastal inundation, a range of hazards. And then if our assets are exposed, are they sensitive? So some of our roads may be able to handle flooding better than others. And then finally, if that road is impacted, what is the ability of that road itself, but also the surrounding network to respond? So are there redundancies built into the system, or is this kind of a choke point in our transportation system? So all those add up to really give us an overall vulnerability score for all of our transportation assets across the state. So we're in the process of finalizing that analysis and then laying that over our mapping so we can really look across the state and see where our key vulnerabilities are.
Is that primary and secondary?
It is, yes, for all VDOT owned or maintained roads. So again, won't go too in depth here, but basically this just shows how we will look at all of our assets and see, is it either vulnerable and or is it critical? We will then apply the consideration of our toolbox of resilience strategies. And then we'll combine that with the cost benefit piece that I mentioned to see, okay, maybe we won't always have the funding on hand for a capital project, but we may be able to enhance maintenance measures there. We may be able to enhance, detour planning, that kind of thing. So this is kind of the overall framework for how we will look at our vulnerable infrastructure and then evaluate how to mitigate. So this tool, a draft of which you can see here on the slide, will ultimately be used for one thing for kind of the higher level planning, like I said, so looking across kind of statewide or regionally and seeing where our greatest needs are from a flooding perspective. But then it can also be used once those needs are identified to kind of zoom in a bit and see more at the project level what the true vulnerabilities are projected out through the lifetime of that asset, and to help consider what the best mitigation measures may be to address the vulnerability in a specific area. So I mentioned kind of that toolbox of resilience measures. So once we have the mapping for where we're most vulnerable, we'll then go to this toolbox that we're currently developing. So this will be getting at, again, all of our business practices to see where we can either enhance our existing practices from a resilience lens or bring on new practices. So a critical piece of this is what we call our adaptive design criteria. So if we are vulnerable in a certain area, if we do expect to see increased precipitation, increased sea level rise in the future, how do we adapt that design to prepare for those future impacts that we're projecting? So this will be done across a number of VDOT divisions, including our structure and bridge manual, our drainage manual, our pavement and geotech guidance. So this will really allow us to look not just at kind of current impacts on our roadways, but projected out through the life of that asset. How do we need to modify the design of our roadways in the future to prepare for future flooding? And then we're also looking at other physical enhancement practices, things like flood barriers, breakwaters, enhanced stormwater, slope stabilization. So really just trying to develop a full toolbox. So we have pretty robust set of responses depending on the situation. So in addition to those kind of capital measures, we're also looking at changes to our administrative and policy processes internally. So our procurement, how may we need to adapt the way we procure materials, the way we manage staff. And then also, we understand we're not going to be able to elevate every roadway in the state to respond to flooding. So a lot of what we're also looking at is our operations and maintenance and emergency management. So where can we adapt the way we respond to flooding? So knowing that a roadway will flood, how can we, like I mentioned earlier, how can we better plan detours? How can we better communicate with the public ahead of a storm or during an event? How can we increase, signage? How can we add flood sensors and better tie in, weather to our response? So we've got a number of activities there. I'll touch on one here in a minute. And another tool in our toolbox is natural and nature-based solutions. So this is some work that our environmental division is doing to look at how can we evaluate whether our more traditional gray structural solutions, which you see on the left, which things like concrete and riprap to stabilize a shoreline, where are those appropriate versus where can we look at a more nature-based solution that also have additional benefits, not just to stabilize that asset, but to also provide ecosystem benefits, tourism benefits, clean water benefits. So we're currently evaluating, again, kind of a full suite of these nature-based solutions and seeing where they're appropriate to bring into our assets. And we currently have a pilot project going on right now in the Northern Neck. Kind of looked across the state and found some problem areas. And we're currently looking at, again, a suite of these measures that we may be able to apply to an erosion issue that we're currently having. So we're really developing a framework that looks at all these different measures and sees where they're most appropriate. You can see at the top there, these measures range from being more like a traditional gray infrastructure with maybe some additional plantings that can bring some ecological benefit to, on the right, a more green marsh restoration project that can also help to stabilize our roadways. So we'll be rolling this out over the next year and really trying to use this as a pilot to see, again, how we can apply these concepts across our assets. I've mentioned the cost benefit. This is another kind of critical piece. So once we know where we're vulnerable, once we have that suite of options, looking at what is the most cost beneficial option to apply to mitigate flooding in a particular area. So we're really trying to capture, obviously, the cost, the upfront cost, as well as the maintenance operations cost of a particular measure, but then also what are the benefits from a public perspective? What is the reduced congestion, emissions benefits, overall time savings? So these are all elements that we'll be capturing when we're looking out to the future, seeing what is the most cost beneficial solutions to flooding. And then finally, I mentioned the flooding piece, obviously a major aspect of this. So this is something we're certainly still working on, looking at how can we incorporate resilience needs into our current investment and planning processes. And also how can we incorporate resilience into our existing funding programs, or do we need new funding programs specifically for resilience? And then also what new funding opportunities are available externally to fund these resilience efforts. So fortunate to have the Promoting Resilient Operations for Transformative, Efficient, and Cost-Saving Transportation, or PROTECT program. Been saying that for 2 years, and I will never remember what that stands for. So this was funded under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and Virginia's receiving around $38 million a year in formula funding through this program. And there's also a discretionary grant piece that I'll mention. So the PROTECT program can fund a range of resilience activities, including coastal planning. So a lot of our resilience plan work has been funded through this. Can fund resilience improvements, like some of the projects that I've mentioned, including the nature-based solutions. Community resilience, so enhanced evacuation route planning. And then at-risk, the hardening of at-risk infrastructure. So hardening to our coastal assets. So I mentioned that $38 million in formula funding that we have annually. We've applied that to a number of areas, again, to support our resilience planning. All of those research studies that I mentioned have been supported through this funding. and capacity building. We're starting to roll out internal resilience trainings to our VDOT staff to really make sure this knowledge is making its way throughout the agency. We're also working on evacuation route planning, but the bulk of this funding initially has gone to hardening and elevation of bridges that we know are vulnerable to flooding throughout the state. So we're already putting this money to work in our roadways today. And then, as I mentioned, we were awarded a discretionary grant in 2024, which is the last piece I'll touch on here. So we're calling this the MOVER program. So it'll basically be a suite of technology solutions that'll allow us to make sure that we're really providing the ability to navigate during an emergency event and any kind of extreme weather event. So this kind of pilot is focused on, as you can see, the Hampton Roads, Fredericksburg, Richmond, and central office areas. But again, we're kind of using this as a pilot to really test out the suite of technologies, which you may not be able to read up there, but things like closed circuit televisions, flood sensors, storm gauges, traffic monitoring systems. So again, just looking at that full suite of tools from an operational perspective, that'll really make sure we can facilitate evacuations and travel during flooding events. So we'll be rolling this out over the next couple of years and then seeing how we can best apply these concepts throughout the state. So I think that's all I have. And I welcome any questions and look forward to the conversations today.
Any questions for Chris?
I'll be around if you want to chat. Thanks.
Matt, we had a question for Rachel from an online participant. If we could go back to Rachel quickly.
All right, if you're able to answer, just to clarify, is there only one tribe in Virginia that has a FEMA approved HMP as a mitigation plan?
We're going to ask Debbie to comment in the chat to confirm, but yes, at this time, one has a standalone plan. Several others may be participating in the PDC planning efforts, but yes.
Great. I think that was the only online question for now. So thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. All right, we're going to get on to our next presentation, and we've got Angela Davis here from Virginia Department of Conservation, and she is the Division Director for Floodplain Management.
Good afternoon, everyone. Not as tall. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So I'm going to talk about floodplain management in Virginia and one of the specific components of floodplain management that my division covers. So as many of you may already know, flooding is the #1 hazard in Virginia, nationally and globally. DCR serves as the NFIP, or National Flood Insurance Program, state coordinating agency. We are the liaisons with FEMA and the localities to ensure compliance with the National Flood Insurance Program. On the screen, you'll see some statistics about the flood insurance saturation in Virginia, as well as some stats about coverage nationally. What you'll see on here also demonstrates that floods happen outside of the mapped floodplain areas, but knowing your risk is still important. The National Flood Insurance Program was created in 1968 by the National Flood Insurance Act. The National Flood Insurance Program does require communities to adopt and enforce regulations that enables them to obtain flood insurance that is federally backed. Some other benefits of participation also include the ability to access federal grants and loans, the ability to access assistance post-disaster, as well as to be able to access federally backed mortgages in those localities that participate in the National Flood Insurance Program. The overall goals of the program are to protect life and property. It also encourages a comprehensive approach to managing the floodplains. So from this diagram you can see on the screen, there are 4 major components of the National Flood Insurance Program. Those include risk identification and mapping, setting standards and regulations for what can be done as in terms of land development within those identified floodplains, mitigating any hazards or risks that are associated with those floodplains, and ensuring the properties so that in the event of a flood, they can bounce back quickly. So we're going to review the risk map process, which is the standard process that FEMA has for evaluating the floodplains across the country. In the Commonwealth, there are currently 43 active flood studies that span more than 90 localities. So over a third of our state is going through some kind of change within their regulatory flood zones. Let me go back one. The first stage of the risk map process is discovery. So risk map itself is an acronym. MAP stands for mapping, assessing, and planning. Once FEMA maps the floodplains, that data can be used for assessing the risk and planning for what to do next. During the discovery phase, FEMA, the localities, as well as DCR convene and gather all of the background information about a locality. We want to learn what keeps the community up at night, what kind of stressors are they dealing with in terms of their physical environments, where are their areas of concern, and what kind of data is already available from both the state and local government that can help refine what is produced on those maps. At the end of the discovery process, FEMA provides a discovery report, discovery maps, and it helps communities really target where those study areas need to be. The second phase of risk map is the analysis and mapping phase. During this phase, there is a flood risk review meeting that occurs with the community. This is one of many touch points that they have to review the data that's been compiled by the federal government. After the engineering data has been modeled, it is put on a draft work map, and the community can see the first blush of analysis for where their flood hazards are in their community. After reviewing those flood maps with the state and federal government, the localities do have a 30-day statutory review period to provide comments back on their areas of concern. The next phase is when the preliminary maps are released for communities. There's another touch point that communities have, which is the community coordination and outreach meeting. At this time, the preliminary maps are made publicly available. So not only does the community have access to them, but they are put on the web so anybody can have access to the first blush of information. There's then a 90-day appeal and comment period that can be engaged by both the local government as well as the general public. An optional flood risk open house is something that we highly encourage communities to do because it provides the general public time to come in, see the maps in person, and talk to their locality about potential impacts to them. And again, this preliminary data is available online in both the mapping formats and all of the reports that are included in the database. So the final stage of the risk map process includes the map adoption. FEMA will provide the letter of final determination to the community, and once they do that, it starts the 180-day adoption period. There are only 180 days or 6 months for the community to fully adopt a compliant floodplain ordinance and those maps. That is the only thing that will get them automatically suspended from the NFIP if that is not done in time. So our division works very closely with communities throughout this process, and especially when we get to the letter of final determination, to make sure that A, our communities can remain compliant with the NFIP, and also to ensure their continued participation. Also during the map adoption process, FEMA produces the summary of map actions, and the summary of map actions shows all of the changes that have occurred to the maps based on the new engineering data. And it also tells the community which letters of map changes have been revalidated and which ones have not. So there are instances where there is an increase to the risk, and therefore the previous letters of map change are no longer valid and have to be reevaluated. Some of the flood risk products that come out of the final stage of risk map are the regulatory products, both the flood insurance rate map as well as the flood insurance study. That is also accompanied with a geospatial database that has all the GIS files, all the shape files, and the modeling information that you can use at the state level within your respective programs to combine with any other data that you need to analyze the floodplains. So why is this important to state agencies? Well, everywhere that is not in black and white, there are regulations tied to them that are pushed down from the federal government and administered at the local level. We would like for state agencies to get more involved in the risk map process, not just consume the data after it's produced. The discovery process is a prime time for you all to get involved. There may be more specific hydraulic or hydrologic data that you can provide. There are transportation agencies that can provide bridges, stream crossings, culvert data. If you already have data that's been modeled, if you think it's good, send it. If you don't think it's good, send it anyways. Once the preliminary maps have been issued, that is the latest regulatory data that the community has available. So we do encourage you to start using it. But after the letter of final determination is issued, it has to be used. So please make sure that you are getting involved throughout the process and help these communities become more resilient. Now, the timeline for risk map is not short, it's not quick, fast, and it's not easy. If we started discovery today, it would probably be at least 5 years before the maps became effective. So please keep that in mind when you're engaging with us, FEMA, and these communities, that it takes some time, but we want to make sure we're producing good products because they are regulatory. So if you have any questions, you can always contact any of us here at the Division of Floodplain Management, myself, our newest NFIP State Coordinator, Brandy Buford over there, or any of our floodplain program planners. And with that, I will take any questions that you may have.
Hi, Angela. How are you?
Good, how are you?
Good. So I wish I would have seen this presentation a few days ago, because on Monday I received a call from a gentleman who lives along the Rappahannock River in Spotsylvania, and I guess Spotsylvania already has their new maps in effect. His property is now considered to be in the floodway, but he was specifically looking for information on, you know, what triggered the change, what circumstance was it that made the change happen? So who is the best person to answer that question for him?
Well, I can answer the long and short of that here, or I could get with you afterwards and we can speak with him directly, however you'd like to handle it. But the short of it is, every 5 years, FEMA is required to reevaluate the communities and determine if there have been enough changes that have occurred to do a full restudy of the floodplains. There may have been increased development. There may have been a significant number of letters of map changes show maybe there's some inaccuracies in the map. We have statewide LIDAR data, which is part of the reason that we're getting updated new maps. A lot of our streams have been redelineated and we just have more data available. So that's what initially triggered that. Him moving into the floodway was probably due to him having more detailed data. That particular community had zone A maps, which were approximated flood zones, and he probably wasn't in the floodway then, but once it was remapped, that's the more detailed data differentiates the flood zones.
Okay, so I'll just send him to you guys next time.
Yeah, you're welcome. Hey, Fred. Yeah.
Fred Kirby with the Division of Engineering and Buildings. So my question, we do the state building permits, and one of the ways that an agency can get permission to build in a floodplain is either using DCR standards or the localities floodplain standards. Are all of the localities, do they have a floodplain management ordinance, or are there some that don't still?
All of the communities that participate in the National Flood Insurance Program definitely have a floodplain ordinance. I say that with a little asterisk next to it. We do have to acknowledge that not all of the floodplain ordinances are compliant with the current standards of the National Flood Insurance Program. And so if they have not been remapped in 20 plus years, they probably haven't updated their ordinance either. And so that does not mean don't follow their floodplain ordinance. It's still in effect and it is still enforceable, but there may be requirements that you don't find explicitly written within the community's floodplain ordinance. That will change. We will eventually get all the communities updated, but it does take some time.
So how many localities aren't in NFIP?
The last count we had was 18 communities.
And are they like at low risk or something?
No, all of them are still at risk. A lot of them are towns within counties that do participate. And so, or they have like very minimal floodplain or very minimal development in proximity to the floodplain. There's a lot of different issues. Not being in the NFIP does not equate to no risk though.
Okay, thanks so much, Angela.
You're welcome.
Any other questions? All right, thank you, Angela.
Thank you.
All right. Up next, we have a presentation on the Virginia Flood Protection Master Plan. And speaking to that is our contractor, Arcadis, and Kristen.
Yeah, hi, thanks for having us, everyone. My name is Krista Jankowski. And as was alluded to by Director Wells earlier, we are hoping to spend some time with you today, kicking off our planning process for the Virginia Flood Protection Master Plan. So we're going to talk to y'all about the work we've kind of been doing to get organized to kind of start that process. And had some placeholder slides, so. Just by way of introduction, my name is Krista Jankowski, as mentioned, and we do have a few other members from our Arcadis team here. John Millspaw, Catherine Johnson, and Madison Teeter are in the room today. But our team extends beyond just Arcadis, so we also have some subcontractors from a few different firms that you may have interacted with in the past, maybe with some other planning efforts. So we have folks from Emergent Method, Launch Consulting, Hirschman Water and Environment, and the Water Institute. And so we've got a big team to work with all of you to try and really address the problems and come up with solutions around how the state can address flooding and sort of update that work that you all are doing. So today, we really want to have some pretty basic outcomes from this meeting, but they're really fundamental and important for this process that we're hoping to engage with you all on over the next several months. So really for stakeholders who are listening in and who are in the room, we really want to make sure that everyone has a clear understanding of the purpose of the plan, the Flood Protection Master Plan. We want to make sure that folks are feeling confident about your role in that plan and as we're moving forward. Understanding the development timeline of this process, right? Because, planning can go on for an extended period of time, but we do have a due date for this one. So we want to make sure we all understand where that's going. And then, as was alluded to earlier, making sure that there are open lines of communication. Folks are feeling comfortable talking about the work that needs to be done and how we're going to get to the end of this process and get a plan that's actionable and that folks are really going to be able to use to increase resilience in the state. And then our team, what we're really looking to get out of today is understanding how best to communicate with you all through this process and make sure that we're able to access your insights and expertise through the feedback and through conversations and the work that we're going to do together. as well as understanding your expectations of our team as this is developed, right? How can we all work together and kind of get to the end of this process and come out with a plan that everyone's proud of and that we're making a difference with. So, and I believe that this was already presented earlier, right? So just to kind of set the stage here, the Virginia Flood Protection Master Plan is meant to be an actionable plan for the Commonwealth to use in crafting policies and programs to mitigate the impacts of flooding on the people, the economy, and the environment, right? And so in order to achieve that, we really want to look at what is the motivation behind trying to put together this plan and working towards these goals. And so there are a number of motivations. These are just 3 of them. There are others in addition, but really when we're talking about kind of the big picture, we're thinking about there's recurrent flooding and we want to be minimizing losses within the Commonwealth, and also recognizing that flooding is changing and it's happening in places maybe it didn't happen previously, or it's more severe or more frequent. And so really understanding how we can address that, enhancing resilience for the people and the communities that that are served by the Commonwealth, and then a need for a coordinated approach, right? We heard in previous presentations about the different groups that are put together, so different folks and state agencies are able to talk to each other and coordinate and meet regularly and have those conversations. And we want to use this process to sort of build on what you all are already doing, and to use those conversations you all are already having, have some more conversations, and really use that as the basis of this planning process. And it was mentioned, this plan will be updated every 5 years. So this is the first go at it, and then we'll get a chance to start again 5 years after that. So, excuse me. To sort of put some framework around this, or to think through the context in which this new plan is being put together, we want to, just point to the other work that's been ongoing and other planning processes. So this flood protection master plan, it's intended to inform smaller scale plans that may be happening at more local levels, but also to have the ability to take in feedback and understanding from other processes that are happening. As has been mentioned, the plan is meant to help guide and be a resource for folks working at the state level, and so at state agencies, to work together on their policies and programs to increase resilience. And so it's different from some other planning efforts in that regard as to who is being targeted for kind of what that planning process is, and then allowing that focus on working with state agencies and folks like y'all in the room and online to really spread the work throughout other state initiatives, right? And so starting with core stakeholders, starting with a few people, and continuing to build out the impact of the planning by using those networks and using those other initiatives that are already in place or already moving forward. So really just trying to magnify the impact of the work that y'all are doing. The flood protection master plan has 3 main components, and I'm just going to give sort of an overview of what those look like and what is intended to be a part of each of those. So there will be a flood impact summary, a flood resilience gap analysis, and then policy and program strategy. For the flood impact summary, the planning process is going to involve looking and reviewing looking at and reviewing flood data, taking into account asset inventories and information about population, economic, environmental, and critical infrastructures, and developing and performing a statewide impact analysis. And the outcome of that work is to get a more holistic picture of current and future flood impacts across Virginia, and look at how we can better understand, when there is flooding, what that impact is, and how that is, how that can be, and then to get a better idea of how we might go about addressing that. The flood resilience gap analysis is a process by which we are working to identify gaps in flood data. So where do we need more information? What kind of information? At what scale? To help with the decision-making process and with addressing flood risk, as well as understanding the capacity and resources of the state agencies who are going to be a part of this planning process to understand where there could be some gaps that may need to be filled or areas to make improvement, and how those things may help to address flooding more effectively, more efficiently, relying on coordination across things. So really the idea of looking at all of the things that are already being done and seeing where there's some areas where we might be able to do just a little bit more. Not to give everyone more work to do, but how can we make it a better process, and how can we really be strategic about how we're working through that. And then, so the outcome of that will be a list of potential actions that can be considered to try to address those gaps in data resources and capacities. And then the third part is really a policy and program strategy. And so the idea is to create a shared vision of and shared goals for the plan. What is it we're really trying to achieve with this plan? There are lots of planning processes that have been happening and are continue to happen. So what are we trying to achieve with this? And how can we all kind of have that same vision as we're working through the process? How can we identify resilient strategies that will help us to address those gaps that we identified in the first or in the previous section? And then how can we have a plan for implementation, right? We can write down a lot of big ideas, but if we don't know exactly how it's going to look when we actually try to make it happen, it's harder to make it happen. So how can we get that implementation roadmap and make sure that everyone feels that they understand what their role is and that they're capable and able to do that within, you know, their role and within their agency and working across agencies. So the idea is that that outcome will then be an actionable strategy to achieve that vision and goals that we're looking at, and looking at, you know, how can we not only go forth in trying to achieve that, but also measure it and make sure we're being effective and have metrics and understanding of whether or not we're meeting the goals that we're setting out to achieve. And so this process is starting now. Well, it started a couple months ago, but we're here today and starting with understanding and getting sort of that baseline information around risk and around flood impacts and where resources and capacities stand now for folks involved in this process. Moving through to the fall and into the winter, really looking to conduct and continue to work on that flood impact analysis, as well as having additional conversations to understand how that impact analysis may inform the types of policies and programs and changes or improvements to processes around resilience and flooding that we may want to include in that policy and program strategy. And moving through that, there will be final plan products, including a written plan, a story map viewer, excuse me, and those types of things. So there will be not just the process of putting together the plan, but also creating the documents, creating the tools that folks can reference in order to see the process that has been gone through, see the decisions and recommendations that have been made, and really put that plan into practice. When we're looking at developing this plan, we realize that there are many people who are interested in flooding and are concerned with flooding in the Commonwealth, and we want to make sure that you know, we are, and not just are interested and concerned, but are working on this and working to address it and working to reduce that flood risk every day in their roles. And so we really are looking at involving people in different ways based on how they're already interacting with these questions around flooding and these issues around flooding. So what we have identified are 3 sort of categories of stakeholders who will be involved in this process, of which those of you who are listening right now are a part of these categories. So we have identified core stakeholders, which are folks like yourselves who are parts of state agencies or entities that will play a critical role in helping to develop or implement the policies and programs that are included in the plan at the end of this planning process. So these are folks who are working within agencies that are directly addressing flood risk or are really thinking about, what's going on with the flooding, where it's happening, and are responsible in their roles for trying to address that through their work. But we also know that there are a lot of supporting stakeholders that can be involved in this process and who have different perspectives and different information that they can share with us as well. So folks who are maybe outside of that core group of stakeholders, but who have a vested interest in the plan, who are going to be impacted by the plan's activities and therefore should have a voice in kind of what's going on with that, and being able to provide their expertise to better inform and have that, again, holistic and more comprehensive plan as the outcome. And then, of course, there's the general public, right? There are all sorts of folks, different entities, organizations, individuals who are going to be engaged in this process, who are going to have a chance to follow along with this process as the plan is being developed, and also be informed about the conversations that are happening and sort of the information that we're finding out along the way. So here, just providing a list of who we have identified as core stakeholders. You'll notice that these are members of the Flood Resilience Advisory Committee that was just already spoken about earlier, as well as folks from a number of different offices and departments within the state government, as well as other entities. And at this point, now we've talked about there are people who are going to be involved, there's a plan, but okay, what is that process actually going to look like? And so really want to give a sort of set the stage for what this is going to look like between now and the end of next year, 2025, when this plan is due. So this really is a meeting to set the stage for what the future work is going to be to put this plan together, and to really think of how we're going to have conversations and how we're going to sort of walk through this process of needing to put together this plan. And so I'm just going to walk through the steps that we're going to follow, or that we're hoping to follow to look at putting this plan together. And so really it's organized around a number of decision-making points, or a number of points of having conversations around focus topics, around visions, goals, and objectives, around those gaps that we may identify that needs to be addressed, identifying strategies for addressing those gaps. There's lots of ways to attack a problem, and how may we go about that makes the most sense and maybe most effective or efficient, or can leverage resources and take into account those types of things, as well as developing, again, that implementation roadmap. So there's a lot on this slide, but I'll try and guide us through the most important key points that I want to point y'all to, which is the first step in the process after the stage setting and kind of saying, okay, we're going to kick off this process. The first step is really determining what the vision, the goals, and the objectives of the plan are going to be, right? So if we are able to collectively define or a clear outcome and have that sort of guiding light for what we're trying to achieve, that allows us to really focus in on all the different steps in the process to really move forward and have that understanding of what we're trying to achieve. So the first thing is to develop that vision and goals and objectives. The way that we are intending to do that is by putting together a draft set of goals and objectives, and looking at the work that agencies are already doing, the goals and objectives that they already have within their resilience plans and those types of things, and really looking at what are the core elements that really tie those together, what are the common themes, and what is sort of a goal or a vision that those things are coalescing around that is related to that flood resilience and to reducing flood risk. Following the putting together of that sort of draft goals and vision, we were going to engage folks, both the core stakeholders that we talked about, as well as supporting stakeholders, in a feedback session, where really what we're looking to do is say, these are ideas that we have found, these are the things we've heard in conversation with you all, and we want feedback on what is developing? What are those themes that are coming out? What are the goals that you all have for how flood resilience work could look, and how these processes could be functioning into the future? What's missing? What can we strengthen? And really have that chance to get feedback, and then go back to our desk and continue to refine those goal statements, refine those objectives and visions, or vision statement, and then come back together in an in-person workshop, not unlike this one that we're in right now, and sit around the table and have conversation around what can that sort of collaborative, collective vision statement look like? What are the words we're going to put on the paper that kind of encapsulate what we're trying to do with this flood protection master plan, and to really get sort of that framework together and have that be what can guide us through the following processes. Following that, we're going to look to prioritize what gaps, again, in resources, in capacity, in data, what types of gaps, where are there opportunities for the flood work to be better in the Commonwealth, and really how can we choose what we're going to go after? What are we going to try to address first? Understanding that this is a plan that's going to be updated in 5 years. So if we have a 5-year chunk of time and we want to put together some policies and programs, what would we like them to address? What are the first things that we want to look to? And again, the process will follow a similar structure, which is starting out with information that we're looking at from the work that's already being done and the gap analysis that we are conducting. And then again, having feedback session, having a presentation of what we find. Are there things we're missing? Did we misconstrue something? Making sure that we're all looking at the same information and understanding it in a way that when we come together again in an in-person workshop, that we can have those conversations to really discuss how those gaps that are identified could impact plan objectives. Are they things that will, if we are able to solve them, will they get us closer to the goals that we outlined at the start of the process? And really work through that to identify, okay, now we understand that we have goals. Now, what are the problems we're going to try to address that will help us to reach those goals? And then the next step in that process would be to identify those flood resilience strategies that can help us to actually solve those problems, right? There are a lot of different ways that you can address a problem of flooding, say in a residential area, or there are a lot of different ways to attack a problem, but there is a need to sort of come together and have a collective and cooperative vision of how, as state agencies, how as folks working across the state, across geographies, across different community types, how can we really identify what strategies are best suited to address the problems that we have identified, and the gaps that need additional effort. So again, a process of having some starting information, having conversations around that, and opportunities for feedback, and then following that through with an in-person workshop where really the idea to discuss how those potential strategies that are being discussed could improve the plan objectives, could help us again get closer to that vision for the Commonwealth of reduced flood risk and better outcomes for the state. And then finally, through that process, looking at how to best implement that, understanding that there are time constraints, there are funding constraints, there are all types of things. Again, all of the core stakeholders and folks who are working on this are already involved in different planning process and different programs and policies. And so how do we really make this something that is actionable, that is possible to move forward and to put into place so that we are working to reduce that flood risk for residents and and how can we make sure that we have the ability to not only start down the road and put that into put that process into place, but also be measuring and monitoring and understanding what impacts that work is having, and making sure that it is having the desired outcome. So identifying roles, responsibilities, and who's going to basically implement this plan, and the different parts of that, and making sure there's collaboration and alignment that is built into that process of putting that plan into practice. But beyond these sort of very structured decision making and feedback based conversations, there are also a number of opportunities for other types of engagement. And so having a meeting for a couple of hours and being able to have conversations in a group is very helpful, and will illuminate a lot of things. But there's also value in one-on-one conversations to really dive into details and really follow up on conversations that we may have in the group setting, and have the chance to talk about those things further. There also, again, it's not just state agencies that we are talking to. We are also considering members of the general public and wanting to understand, their insights and thoughts about how the state can best serve their needs when it comes to flood resilience, and trying to take that into consideration when the conversations are happening around the roles and responsibilities and the direction of the work that we're doing together to put together this plan. So there are a number of ways that these conversations will be happening over the next several months. And so just an understanding that we're really wanting to work to make sure that we get all of the information and are able to really understand where folks are having where these gaps are existing, and where folks are having needs that are currently unmet, and so that we can really try and move forward into that actionable plan that does meet those goals and objectives that are set out in the beginning. And so it looks like the font size on this one is a little small, but this is intended to be sort of an overview of the development schedule of the plan, as well as engagement points. And so really starting here, in September 2024 with this plan and the stage setting meeting, looking forward in the next couple of months in November to that process of determining the vision, goals, and objectives, moving through the winter, really finalizing those, as well as starting to talk about those gaps that need to be addressed, and moving forward through the process. Also engaging with other bodies and entities that are doing this work. So engaging and coordinating or aligning our work with the Flood Resilience Advisory Committee meeting that will be happening in early next year, and then moving forward through the spring and summer to identifying those resilience strategies, finalizing those, and then developing that implementation roadmap. And then through to the end of the year, really putting that on paper, putting it out into the plan, and then starting the work of taking the action. And so I alluded to, there are a few different products that are going to come out of this process. So again, a written plan, and then there will be an implementation guide as well that works alongside that implementation roadmap. We have, this is the plan for how we're going to get it done, and here's additional information to guide that process. Having interactive tools digitally, so story map and data viewer, to have access to the information that sort of is in support of the plan and the conclusions of the plan, and being able to make that available, as well as providing information on the Virginia Flood Protection Master Plan webpage, to make sure that there's information about the purpose and the process, and kind of updates along the way. So again, that was a high-level overview, right? There's a lot to get done over the next several months, but really the idea is that we understand there are a lot of planning processes that have been ongoing, that are continuing to be ongoing, and this is really targeted to really think about how to coordinate and have that collaboration across state agencies to guide the policies and programs that y'all are working on to address the flood needs that are so evident in the Commonwealth. So with that, open up for any questions.
Any questions on the plan? There's a quiz later. All right. Thank you very much. So we really just scratched the surface today with the state agency presentations. These aren't the only 3 agencies that are working in this space. We don't have enough time in one meeting to really cover that. Today, really giving you a high-level overview of some of those important updates, but really getting this group together to start this coordination process, working with us to help develop the plan. So really excited to get that going.